There is only one real problem in the world, and it doesn't matter whether the desired accomplishment is managing a sports team, building a business, or running an empire. The problem is the same: leadership. Because of the tremendous consequences involved and outcomes that affect the lives of so many, the importance of leadership is immutable through the ages and highly relevant into the future. Welcome to the Leadership Lyceum, a CEO's virtual mentor. Now, here's your host, Tom Lindquist.
Welcome to the debut of the Leadership Lyceum. It's a podcast series. We'll bring you direct access to top CEOs and directors of boards in an interview format that provides insight on situational issues that confront CEOs every day. Think of it as a CEO's virtual mentor. Welcome back. Thanks for joining for the conclusion of our two-part series with Jonathan Baliff of Bristow Group. In part one, we introduced you to Jonathan and gave you his career history and covered his business and leadership priorities for leading in a downturn. In this part two, he'll share his experiences going through the succession process himself and provide advice to CFOs considering the path to CEO. And in his words, what got you here doesn't necessarily get you there. Stay tuned. Going back in time to the transition you made from CFO to CEO, talk about that transition.
Well, I mean, I think, frankly, Tom, even though there was another executive search firm doing the succession planning at my company, you were an advisor, and my company knew you were an advisor because of our friendship and the trust I have in you to talk about these types of transitions. And I think it also, during the process, gave you a unique insight into my development program. But, I think, the Bristow board and my predecessor, Bill Childs, who was CEO before me, both had a very world-class view of how to do the succession planning, which involved, obviously there was a nature of a competition, but it was much more done with the concept of development more, as much, maybe not more, because I didn't have perfect insight while it was going on, to just, put a body in a role, right? It was much more about the development of the company, not just the people. And then during that development process, the board could also observe who had both the best potential to be a very good CEO, but also how the team would change and then also get better with the new CEO. And so, that involved an evaluation for me, and I had the unfortunate, and I do believe it's the unfortunate circumstance of being a very successful CFO by the traditional measures of a CFO. Mm-hmm. Traditional measures are you improving the financial position of the company? Are you able to create growth? I was a CFO who also had a very strategic mandate in M&A and other areas of the company from a strategy standpoint. So it wasn't just a role in which you were accounting or counting, as I say. You also had a real role in how to grow the business, especially for us in the assignment of the UK search and rescue contract, which is the largest rotary wing contract of its kind ever in the history of the world. It's the outsourcing of the Maritime Coast Guard Agency in the UK rotary. So all the helicopters that do search and rescue for civilians in the United Kingdom have been outsourced to Bristow. We are in partnership with the MCA and the United Kingdom government, but that was a very big contract that we were able to get assigned to us during my time at CFO. Mm-hmm. All those led to a level of me not being able necessarily to see my weaknesses, because one of the, I think, downsides of success is you become less self-aware as you move through a role, and you're not able to see things. And frankly, people don't give you as much feedback because success has always been viewed as its own kind of tutor, and that's not the case. Right. In many ways, when you're successful, you have to be even more self-aware about things that you might or might not be missing. And I was very lucky that the board put me through a development process that began with a pretty detailed evaluation, not something that was just a survey of people either who worked for me or the board members, but a pretty good development set of discussions that really pointed out some of my development weaknesses, but then gave me time during a year, roughly a year and a half, to work on those development weaknesses in conjunction with the rest of the company and those who were also in competition with me for the CEO process or CEO role. And that was as groundbreaking for me as a person, that development process, as anything probably since the Gulf War or pilot training in the Air Force. I just remember the alterations I made in how I thought about myself and how I thought about leadership, and real heavy, not just self-reflection, but change. And not change caused to be able to get the CEO role, which eventually I got, but not, in many ways there was a paradox, which we'll talk about in how a CFO or anybody can go into a CEO leadership role.
I remember our conversations during that time, and you probably didn't anticipate this sort of change and reflection going into the process, and here you were faced with it, and it seemed like not only a tremendous way of kind of looking at yourself, but probably enhancing for your ability as a leader overall.
Absolutely. I would say right now, especially given, during my tenure here currently as CEO, there's been so much change. There's been so much difficulty in managing the business. A transformation is happening while the downturn is happening, that I would not have been prepared as CEO to manage and lead this company had I not gone through the development program. If for whatever reason I didn't go through the development and then they just kind of anointed me, immediately, which our board is very thoughtful, would not have done. But had they done that, I would not be facing this as well. I would even go so far as to say I'd probably be, I can't say that I don't feel perfectly successful right now, but we are managing through this downturn, and we would not be doing it. I wouldn't be doing it as well and showing the results we've shown had I not gone through that development.
You said something a little earlier, and I just wanted to come back to it, where it almost seemed like you were saying that your success, from the board's perspective, that your success might have cast you as a role player, as a CFO, and perhaps stereotyped you as a CFO. Were you going in that direction?
Now that I've obviously gained about 2 years of perspective in the role and talking to people a little bit, I've gained a little bit of perspective on the succession planning, and even when I came into the company. And I think if I had a more traditional past for the CFO, even though I was a banker, I think the key difference that prepared me for the CEO role, and they're seeing me more than just the CFO, even when I was the CFO, was my time in the cockpit. Really, if I look at my company, over 40%, probably even almost as much as 50% of the employees are pilots. Understanding that employee base and the risks that they take and the risks that they manage, the cockpit of a helicopter or a civilian is not so different than the cockpit of a fighter aircraft, aside from some of the mission issues. And so understanding pilots and understanding that is something that I inherently understood. And also my time in banking, which put me much more, as you know, on the strategic side of things, helped prepare me for this role. Because I was given those mandates, one, to get to work at a company that is an aviation company, and as a former aviator, that meant a lot to the board. And then second, as a practitioner in mergers and acquisitions and strategic assignments, it helped prepare me for a role that was outside of just the traditional CFO role, which I was the first one to tell people when I became CFO, I'm not an accountant by training, but I know how to manage accountants and lead accountants, and that's key. You don't have to do, in fact, you shouldn't, as a CFO or CEO, think that you need to be able to literally have the skill to do everything. There's something wrong if you do. But you need to be able to hold people accountable and do it in a way that's reflective of your background, not try to be somebody you're not.
Right. So with that process, then, there weren't necessarily biases that the board had or individuals might have had toward your fitness for your viability as
I would say
CEO.
not inherently because of the time in the military and the cockpit, but I had not been at the company that long. I think that was probably, if I look back on it, that was a thing even for me. This is it is a complicated company. It's hard running a global $3 billion asset company. We have about $1 billion, $7 billion, $8 billion in revs, but these companies of this size are hard to run. You don't have the level of staff, and yet you're spread. For us, we're in 22 countries, and so you're having, even in heavy growth mode, having to constantly watch your costs. And so, for me, it's something you have to think about as you become a leader of a company like this. Having not as much time at this company, I think, is what was in the background conversation of the board more than whether I was a CFO ready for CEO.
Let's take a break. We'll be right back. What did you learn that would be applicable for those that are about to go through that from the CFO chair? What did you learn about yourself, or maybe kind of universal points to make to a CFO audience about things that you had to change or focus on?
Right. I'd say there's three things I would think about. I think the first thing, as you move into the CEO role from a CFO role, is what got you to be a successful CFO, or whatever got you to be successful, because you're not going to be considered for a promotion wherever you are in an organization unless you were successful. But what got you there isn't necessarily going to get you to be successful in the next role. It's kind of a necessary but not sufficient condition, but also the seeds of your own failure or the seeds of your own inabilities are sown in that success. And so I don't mean that you're your own worst enemy. You just have to get a bit outside of yourself to understand where your gaps are. So that's the first thing. What got you there ain't going to get you to the other place. The second thing is, it is very easy as part of any process for a promotion to a CEO, especially of a listed company, to get very emotionally attached to it. And what I mean by that is, I'm going to relate it to, parents watch their kids play sports all the time, but you can tell the parents who are emotionally attached to it and those who are not, who love watching their child, but they're sitting and understanding, they're rooting, but then everybody knows you don't have to explain the behaviors of somebody who's emotionally attached. You can get that way when you're in the process to become CEO. And what I mean is you attach too much of your self-worth, your other aspects of your success of your life to that process and that possibility, and you've got to really measure that. In many ways, my fitness to become CEO of this company, and what I learned during my development program, is not to want it too much. That take the development program at its face value, or take the promotion process, learn from that promotion process, learn from the development process if you're considered to be a CEO. That's the key. Not wanting to be the CEO, but wanting to learn about becoming the CEO. Very critical, because you'll give up your emotional attachment to it. You won't take it too personally. And the truth is, you don't have direct control over whether you're going to be chosen or not. So don't get too attached to it. Just try and do a good job. I think the last thing is, during that process, your relationships with people, it is about the team. Although you're very focused on your own development, you're very focused on possible promotion, in the end, it is about your team. It's about your team's health and welfare. It's about your team's success. For us, it's about safety. And it's not even just the team that obviously either reports to you or your board who you report to, but it's also the other team members who are going through that process with you. And they're in competition with you, but they're also generally also you're trying to run a company. Think about that team dynamic. Pay attention to it. It's very easy not to, especially the people who report to you. Bring them into the process. Let them know what you're thinking. Show vulnerability. You're not Superman, but you've got to focus. The third, in fact, this third one, I would make the first one. Focus on your team. It's very easy during your development process to focus on yourself. There is a nature to that you have to do, but focus on the team. Think about them. How are they doing? How are they doing during this process? Because they're watching you, going through your development and that promotion, which, let's face it, a lot of companies go through these processes and it tears them apart, tears the company apart, performance of the company goes down. There's a lot of background conversation. There's a lot of unhealthy tension. And so being aware of that for your team's sake is really critical, during these processes.
I want to go back to the first one. What got you there may not get you there. Are there some, as you think generally about CFOs, are there some things that you would say would get them there that they need to be mindful of in thinking about CEO? Are there some tangible points there?
Sure, there is. I think there's one, obviously, that makes sense, which is CFOs, by their nature, are into the numbers, right? And not only the numbers obviously adding up correctly and following the compliance and all the things we have to do, but they're getting better, right? The numbers are getting better. And obviously focusing on that makes you an extremely results-oriented individual. And not saying that CEOs or any COOs or anybody else is not a results. Once you get to a certain level of organization, you better be somewhat results-oriented. However, one of the things you have to do as CFO is you have to think in a more 360-degree way. Results orientation has a tendency to be linear, right? I'm here and I want to get someplace better. I don't have the calculation and now I've calculated it, right? There's a little bit of, like I said, linear thinking. But as CEO, you've got to be much more 360. And one of the aphorisms I've been using at this company, especially in the downturn, is the solutions that we're creating that actually look correct in the downturn, the solutions will create the problems of the future, right? So you've gone from A to B, you've made the numbers look better, you've saved the company, but you have created problems that as CEO you need to understand those problems. You need to think about things, in a more 360-degree way, as opposed to just like I'm going from this place to this place. Because that's not enough. You have to be, as the CEO, you have to definitely think about unintended consequences, implications of the decisions you're making, whether it be a downturn or an upturn, because those will create the problems of the future. And although you might not be able to mitigate them now, you need to be aware of them. That to me is probably one of the big issues I see, because as CFO, you're such a kind of a whack-a-mole. There's issue, and trust me, you've got to do that as CFO because there's so many necessary compliance and other issues to that job. But that success in that does not necessarily lead to success as a CEO. I think, a lot of the same things also, as a secondary to that, is as CEO, you really have to depend on your teams. You have to get comfortable with ambiguity. You have to get comfortable with the difference between holding people accountable and delegating things, and the implications of that accountability is important. And those relationships of your main... I spend a lot of my time with my direct reports and making sure I understand what they're thinking about, listening to their concerns. You do that as CFO, but as CEO, you're doing it at a very different level. And then you also have to understand the interoperability and the interdependence, and create the interdependence between the people who are working for you and get them comfortable with it. So that's another place that a lot of CFOs, you don't, because they're very much like work groups, you have your finance group, your treasury group, your accounting group, you don't see sometimes the need to create a team. They're just work groups. They're getting specific tasks on. As CEO, you're trying to create teams that are interdependent upon each other. And that's something that you got to think about as CEO.
Give an example of creating that interdependency.
The one that occurs to me first is when I became CEO, there was a real need to create a performance and planning group in my operations teams. And that performance and planning group was absolutely meant to look at the KPIs associated with aviation performance. A lot less financial, much more aviation. And we put a gentleman in that group who was really exceptional at performance management, mostly from a financial standpoint. But at the same time, and he came out of the role of kind of financial performance out of the finance groups. But at the same time, also had a finance group that had a financial planning function. It created almost two financial planning groups, one in operations, one in finance. And there was no interdependence. In many ways, they were all of a sudden starting to operate at odds with one another. And we had to restructure that to put it under one person. But it was very uncomfortable because the operations group were now going to have to depend on finance to do their calculations and their thinking about what's going to happen in the future, and then the finance group had to depend on the operations group, as they always do, but even to a larger extent, on getting the information. But once we put it under one group, that was, and you could choose which side you want to go to, but we have it in our finance groups now, just one operations planning, we call it decision support, that's under the CFO. It created that interdependence that now has us working at a much higher level of not just result, but a much higher level of understanding of the business. Mm-hmm. That's a perfect example of between operations, and I'm sure most of the CFOs who listen to this will say, oh yeah, that's the natural tension between operations and finance. Mm-hmm. But if you can create that interdependence with each other and then reward that interdependence, you'll see pretty amazing results.
Let's take a break. We'll be right back with Jonathan Baliff. Let's stay on relationships for a minute, and especially those relationships that have changed in becoming CEO. And maybe the board sits prominent there, the way you interact with the board. What does that look like, and how has that changed?
Sure. First of all, a little context. I am a company that is NYSE-listed, but has a very strong British component to it. We have a fund out of London that puts two board members on our board, or two executives on our board, and we're the merger of a U.S. and a U.K. company that is listed in the U.S. However, we were, for a company our size, we're one of the few companies out there that has a non-executive chairman that's listed in the U.S. A lot of companies my size, they combine the chairman and the CEO role. Mm-hmm. So I have a non-executive chairman, and so that relationship has always been strong. It just so happens that my non-exec chair is a former fighter pilot too, so he's Navy, so we forgive him a bit, and he forgives me too. But the idea is to create those relationships at a different level and recognize what has been lost in those relationships in the newness of the new CEO. In that, my predecessor was much more similar in an age, much more similar in some other backgrounds in life. Not to say that, again, my chairman and I are not so different. We're very similar in how we look at our core values, et cetera. But creating that relationship, because that relationship I had with him as CFO was very different. Mm-hmm. And so, to me, that's the key. Is one of the key relationships is, how you relate to your chairman. I would say if you are the chairman and CEO, then you have to create a relationship with your lead outside director, mm-hmm. and also your head of your audit committee. So to me, creating those unique relationships that are based on mutual respect, mutual understanding, knowledge, and not just of the business, but also personally who they are, and be able to have real, authentic, transparent conversations with them that even talk about, your own vulnerability, is kind of critical, mm-hmm. Especially with the, you don't have time to necessarily talk to every board member between board meetings, but, you got to make an attempt to create those relationships in that new role. Don't just depend on those relationships that came from your CFO. And different CFOs have or are able to have different relationships. They always have a relationship, obviously, with their audit committee chair, but creating those relationships in the new context of your role is very, very important. Mm-hmm. But you have to really think about it, because you could spend your whole day doing that. Right. But you have to think about it. And it probably is key in your first year of operating as a CEO. I think the key word there is vulnerability. Be very cognizant that you can show that vulnerability as somebody new in your role, and it's important to be able to do that to create a much more depth to your relationship.
And I would imagine what comes of that then, when you're showing that vulnerability, is a coaching and a mentoring that's going on? Or how would you describe that?
Yeah, I think it depends, right? I mean, everybody doesn't have a supreme knowledge base, but I think especially if there are certain board members that have particular expertise. For example, we're growing in areas of government rotary wing, so we don't just do oil field services. We are growing our government rotary wing and fixed wing services. And so being able to talk to one of my board members who comes from a government background, really critical, right? There's no doubt that I have board members who are also former CEOs, so being able to do things from that standpoint. But it's really kind of approach people from where they are. Be cognizant of their time too, and also be cognizant that you as CEO are making decisions, that they can give you advice, but in the end, it isn't a jump ball; it's your decision. But I have a tendency to find my gut through conversation, and so to me, it comes more naturally than with others.
In closing, give advice to a board that's considering a CFO as CEO, and advice to a CFO that's considering it or that's going to vie for it.
Right. For a board or a chairman that is considering a CFO, it really would be difficult for me to give advice based on role. It's more based on, if you have candidates who are ready to be considered as CEO, the couple things I would say is, one, that process, during the process, has to be as transparent as possible. But you also have to balance that against being able to give too much information. One of the issues during that process is there might be people who are doing better than others in their development, but it's very difficult to give them that feedback because you'll end up affecting the outcome without you really wanting to. But balancing that is very difficult. Very difficult, because you could also then tell all the candidates, hey, you're the guy. Be very careful about expectation setting. That's what I would tell boards. Be very careful about expectation setting, and be careful about it. And the second thing in that process is the process of development and looking at the succession has to be viewed as a very difficult process as you go along, i.e., don't make this longer than it should be. Especially if also there's a successor, the predecessor has to also come up with a retirement package, or what is the predecessor can do. Try and keep the whole process to just the minimum time necessary. I can't tell you what that time is. I feel like it's more than a month. It's less than a year and a half, but probably less than a year. It shouldn't be that long, because you can make the decisions within a 6 month to a 1 year period of time. Do that as a board. Take the tough decisions, because as it goes longer, that expectation setting becomes that much more difficult. And also, know one thing, that when you go through that process, whether you're, again, as a CFO or if you're another executive, it's exhausting. It takes a lot out of you. So that's the thing. For the candidate, it's almost on the other side, right? And if you're a CFO, the hard part is you also have your day job, and you really should be focused on that day job. Take the learnings that you're getting from your development process and apply them to being a great CFO. Don't try to be, as CFO, CEO in waiting. Don't think that that's going to help you. Don't try and take the learnings you're getting to become a great CEO, but apply them to becoming a better CFO. Don't wear the CEO on the sleeve, right? That is, during your development process, that creates that emotional attachment. And by the way, the board doesn't want to see that. The board wants to see you take your learnings and do your job. And while you do that and you improve as an executive, that will show them the potential you have to become a very good, effective, heartfelt CEO. And know also that you don't have control over the situation, right? The nature of what the business might need might not be what you can give them, and that's okay too. If the board decides on somebody else to be CEO, it might have absolutely nothing to do with how well you did in development, who you are. It might be that, hey, the business is at a point where they still need you as CFO. And you just, again, that's the don't get emotionally attached to the promotion. And that's the advice I would give. If you are, married, this puts your spouse in a lot of pressure too. And so again, it sounds like, you're having to attend to a whole bunch of things, but the truth is, that's what I do now as CEO. I spend a lot of time with my wife. I spend, I really make, and I'm not perfect by far, but you really have to be attentive to your partner during the development process, and then afterwards. It's very easy, especially, again, remember, the success can create the seeds of your failure. You have to be very cognizant of your partner during this process.
Yeah, especially
saying thank you a couple times a day or a minute, really helps.
You set aside time and just alone time that you guys go do things together.
That's right.
And
That's
make
right.
sure that's planned as part of your day and week.
That's right. And I'm very lucky that, Barbara was in the Air Force too, so she actually understands the aviation world really well, and she becomes part of the process of managing, maybe not the company, but obviously being part of the family, especially with my direct reports.
Excellent. Jonathan, thanks for being part of this and
no problem,
having
Tom.
me here.
Thank you.
Been a great discussion.
We hope you enjoyed that conversation with Jonathan Baliff, CEO of Bristow Group. Coming up next in the Leadership Lyceum, what's it like going from CFO to CEO by joining a company controlled by Carl Icahn? We'll sit down with Mark Pytosh, CEO of CVR Partners, a Houston-based publicly traded master limited partnership that owns fertilizer processing facilities. It's controlled by Carl Icahn, Icahn Enterprises. See you next time. And before you get swept away with your everyday activities, please take a moment and go to the iTunes podcast section and download the Leadership Lyceum app. It's free, and it will enable future content to come to you automatically, so you will not miss an episode. Please rate us, spread the word among your fellow executives and board colleagues, and enjoy the latest conversation with your next virtual mentor. The Leadership Lyceum, a CEO's virtual mentor, has been a production of Dinosaur Productions, LLC. Copyright 2016, all rights reserved. Stay tuned. It's lonely at the top.